Every morning, when the town was still quiet and the sun was only beginning to shine, an old man walked slowly to the small park in the center. His steps were soft and careful, and his back was a little bent with age, but his eyes were calm and full of thought. In the middle of the park there was a wooden bench under a tall tree. This bench was not special to most people, but to the old man it seemed to carry great meaning. He always sat in the same place, on the left side of the bench, and placed his hands on his knees. People in the town grew used to this picture. Some passed by him on their way to work, some children ran past him on their way to school, and some others pushed strollers while glancing at him. Everyone noticed him, but nobody really knew why he came there every day. He did not bring food, he did not talk much, and he did not sleep on the bench. He only sat and watched, sometimes looking at the path that crossed the park, sometimes lifting his eyes to the sky as if waiting for something or someone. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and still the old man returned to the bench, rain or shine, warm days or cold days. Some people smiled politely at him, others whispered among themselves, but the old man stayed silent. His presence became part of the town, like the church bell or the fountain in the square. People wondered, but nobody dared to ask. And so, the mystery of the man on the bench began to live quietly in the hearts of everyone who saw him. As time went by, curiosity began to grow in the town. Children, who were often the most honest and direct, were the first to ask questions. On their way to school, they would walk past the park and see the old man sitting quietly, looking straight ahead, as if he expected someone to come down the path. One little boy once asked his mother, "Why is that man always there? Doesn't he get bored?" The mother smiled, but she did not know the answer. She only said, "Maybe he is waiting for a friend." Another girl asked her father if the old man was poor or lonely. The father shook his head and said, "No, he does not look poor. Perhaps he just likes the park." But deep inside, even the parents were unsure. They themselves had wondered many times, but they did not dare to disturb the man. Neighbors began to whisper stories to each other. Some said he was waiting for a lost son, gone long ago. Others believed he was meeting a wife who never returned. A few thought he was simply strange, a man who lived in his own world. These stories spread quietly, from door to door, from shop to shop. People would lower their voices when they spoke of him, as if his mystery deserved respect. Still, nobody really knew the truth. What was certain was that the man's presence touched everyone. He was not loud, he did not ask for attention, but his silence and his steady waiting seemed louder than any words. It was like a question that stayed in the air, "Who are you waiting for, old man?" The children watched him with wide eyes, the adults with quiet hearts, but the answer remained locked inside his gentle smile. One afternoon, when the sky was painted with soft orange light and the air was warm, I found myself walking through the park with no special plan. I had seen the old man many times before, always from a distance, but that day something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the shadows stretched long across the grass, or the way his figure seemed smaller against the tall tree behind him. For the first time, I slowed my steps and really looked at him. His clothes were simple but neat, his shoes polished though clearly old, and in his hand he held a small book. He did not open it, he only rested it gently on his lap. His face was full of lines, but those lines were soft, like rivers that had carried both sorrow and kindness. I stood there for a while, pretending to watch the fountain, but in truth, my eyes kept returning to him. A strange feeling touched me, part curiosity, part sympathy, and part something I could not explain. It was as if his waiting was not just his own, but something shared, something that reached the heart of anyone who saw him. My thoughts became louder inside me. Why do you sit here, old man? Who do you hope to see? Finally, after many days of silence, I decided that I could not just pass by anymore. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer to the bench. The sound of my steps on the gravel seemed louder than usual, and I wondered if I was disturbing him. But when I stood near, he lifted his eyes and gave me a small, gentle smile. There was no surprise in his look, as if he had been expecting someone to come, though not knowing who. My heart beat a little faster. I cleared my throat and said softly, "Good evening, sir." His smile widened just enough, and with a voice calm and warm like the fading day, he answered, "Good evening." For a moment, we sat in silence, though I was still standing beside the bench. The air smelled of grass and the faint perfume of flowers from the gardens nearby. I felt unsure, like a child about to ask a difficult question. Finally, I gathered courage and said, "I see you here often. Do you like this place?" The old man looked at the sky, where the last light of the sun was melting into soft colors, and nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "this place is quiet. It lets a man listen to his own heart." His words were simple, yet they seemed heavier than ordinary speech, carrying a meaning I could not fully understand. I sat down on the other side of the bench, leaving a respectful space between us. The wood was cool beneath me, and I felt strangely honored to share the seat that many people only passed by. I tried again. "You must enjoy the peace here. I don't think I could sit so still for so long." He chuckled softly, a sound like the turning of an old page. "When you have waited as long as I have," he replied, "stillness becomes a friend." I looked at his face, searching for more, but his eyes were far away, focused not on me but on something invisible in the distance. My curiosity grew stronger, but I was careful. I wanted to ask directly, "Who are you waiting for?" Yet I held back, afraid that the question might break the gentle trust already forming between us. Instead, I asked, "Do you read that book in your hands?" He touched the cover softly, almost like one touches a memory. "Sometimes," he said. "But most days, I do not need to. I only keep it close." His voice grew quiet, and I understood that he did not wish to say more. A silence returned, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence where two people breathe the same air and somehow share a thought without words. As the lamps in the park began to glow, I stood up and said politely, "It was nice speaking with you." He nodded once more, his smile faint but kind. "Come again," he answered. And though After that first short conversation, I could not stop thinking about the old man. Each time I passed the park, my eyes searched for him, and each time, without fail, he was there. Morning, afternoon, even on gray rainy days when the ground was wet and the air was cold, he came. His presence was as certain as the rising of the sun. Soon, I began to notice the details of his routine. He always arrived around the same hour, just as the church clock struck 4. He walked slowly but steadily, leaning a little on his cane, and when he reached the bench, he sat down with a soft sigh of relief, as though the wooden seat was an old friend welcoming him back. Sometimes he carried a small book, sometimes a single fresh flower, and sometimes nothing at all but his quiet self. When he brought a flower, he would place it gently on the bench beside him, like a silent offering to someone who was not there. When he carried the book, he almost never opened it, he only rested his hand on the cover, as if holding on to something important inside. I also noticed the way he looked at the path that cut through the park. His eyes followed every person who walked by, as though he was searching for a face among the strangers. But when the person passed without stopping, his gaze softened again, patient and calm. There was no anger, no sadness too sharp, only a waiting that seemed endless yet full of hope. The more I watched him, the more I felt that his routine was not empty at all. It was full of meaning, even if hidden. And though I still did not know his story, I began to feel a quiet respect for him. Many people rushed through their days, busy and distracted, but the old man carried a kind of peace with him, as if he had chosen his purpose and stayed faithful to it. The days grew longer, and with them my curiosity. Each time I saw the old man sitting alone, I felt a gentle pull to approach him again. It was not only the mystery of his waiting that drew me, but also the calmness he carried. In a world that often hurried forward, he seemed to stand still, and that stillness began to teach me something, though I could not yet name it. One evening, I gathered my courage once more and walked to the bench. The old man looked up and smiled, just as kindly as before, as though he had been expecting me. This time, I sat down beside him without hesitation. "Good evening," I said, and he nodded softly. For a while, we simply watched the people passing on the path. A child laughed, a dog barked, the fountain splashed in the distance. Finally, I spoke. "You are always here," I said gently. "Do you wait for someone?" His eyes flickered, and for a moment I thought he would finally share his secret. But instead, he looked ahead and said, "Yes. I wait." His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something deep and fragile, like glass that could break with one more question. I wanted to ask more, but I felt I should not push. So instead I said, "It must take a lot of patience." At this, he smiled again, but this time his smile carried both sadness and strength. "Patience," he said, "is what keeps the heart alive." Those words stayed with me, echoing in my mind long after I left the park that evening. I did not yet know who he was waiting for, or why, but I began to sense that his story was not only about loss. It was also about love, and the quiet courage of holding on. From that evening onward, I visited the park more often, sometimes by chance, sometimes on purpose. Each time, the old man was there, and slowly I began to see that his days followed a quiet rhythm, almost like music. He would arrive at the same hour, his cane tapping softly on the stones. He would sit down in the same place, his body leaning slightly forward as if ready to rise at any moment. Some days he carried a flower, usually a small white one, and he placed it carefully on the bench beside him. When the wind blew, the petals trembled, but he never moved them. It was as if the flower belonged to someone else, someone who had not yet come to claim it. Other days he brought his book, and though he rarely opened it, he would run his hand across the cover, his fingers tracing the edges as if the story inside was already written in his heart. When he came empty-handed, he would simply fold his hands together and rest them on his knees, his gaze steady on the path. I began to notice how he watched people. If a stranger passed, he would glance at them with hope for a moment, then look down again with patience when the face was unfamiliar. It was never disappointment that showed in his expression, but rather a quiet strength, a gentle promise to keep waiting. Even in rain, he stayed. With an umbrella in one hand and his cane in the other, he sat under the tree while drops tapped on the leaves above him. His coat would grow damp, but he did not leave early. The sight of him, so steady against the weather, touched me deeply. I realized that his waiting was not weak or sad. It was powerful, a choice that gave shape to his life. And I thought to myself, how many of us would sit so faithfully for so long, for someone who may never come? The more I watched the old man, the more I realized that his waiting was not only his own story, it was slowly becoming part of mine. At first, I had only been curious, like everyone else in town. But as the days passed, something inside me began to shift. I found myself thinking of him when I was at home, or at work, or even when I lay awake at night. His patience, so calm and steady, seemed to hold a secret that ordinary life had forgotten. We live in a world that hurries, people rush to finish tasks, rush to earn more, rush to move from one moment to the next. But the old man did not rush. He sat, he waited, and he gave his time freely to something unseen. This made me wonder about my own life. What was I rushing toward? What did I truly wait for? Sometimes, as I walked to the park, I would slow my steps on purpose, trying to taste the air the way he seemed to taste it, noticing the way the light fell through the trees or the sound of children laughing in the distance. It was as if his waiting taught me to see the world differently, not as a race to be won, but as a place where patience itself was a gift. I did not yet know his reason, but I felt that it must be something precious, because no one would wait so long for something small. And though he never told me, his silence spoke louder than words. Love is not measured in speed, but in endurance. That thought stayed with me, and I began to feel a gentle respect each time I sat beside him. Perhaps I was learning more from him than from any book I had ever read. One soft, golden evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of pink and purple, I sat beside the old man once more. The park was quiet, and only the gentle rustle of leaves filled the air. I noticed a change in him that day, something lighter, as if he was willing to let a small part of his story escape. "Do you ever speak of your life?" I asked, careful not to press too hard. He smiled faintly and looked away, toward the horizon. "Sometimes," he said. "But only in small pieces. Small pieces are easier to hold." I nodded, understanding that he would not yet give me everything. And then, slowly, he began to share tiny details. He spoke of a house by a river, a garden full of roses, and the sound of laughter that used to fill the rooms. He spoke of walks in the evening, holding a hand that is no longer there, of meals shared with someone whose absence now felt like a shadow. I listened carefully, letting each word sink in. Even in these small stories, there was a deep sadness, but also warmth, as if he carried a treasure inside his heart, even though it was hidden beneath the weight of time. His eyes often softened when he spoke, and I could see a hint of longing, a glimmer of hope, and the quiet pride of a love that had never faded. I realized then that this man, who sat silently on the bench every day, had lived a life full of connection and care. And though I did not yet know the full reason for his waiting, these small pieces of memory made it clear: he waited not out of habit, or loneliness alone, but out of devotion. I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and admiration. I wanted to ask more, to understand fully, but I sensed that part of the story would come in time, in its own way, when he was ready. So I sat quietly beside him, listening to the wind, the trees, and the gentle rhythm of his voice, feeling that in these moments, I was learning something that could not be taught in any other place. One calm afternoon, I arrived at the park slightly earlier than usual. The air was cool, and the soft scent of flowers drifted from the nearby gardens. The old man was already on the bench, sitting quietly as always, his hands folded over a small book. That day, something in his expression seemed different, softer, perhaps, or a little heavier with memory. I sat beside him and hesitated before speaking. "Do you think about the past often?" I asked. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and warmth, and for the first time, he did not look away or smile politely. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think about someone who once walked beside me in life. Someone very important." My heart beat faster, and I tried to meet his gaze. "Who?" I whispered, though part of me already guessed. The old man shook his head slowly, as if to say the moment was too delicate for names. "It is not time yet," he murmured. "But their memory stays with me, and it guides my days. Even now, when I sit here, I feel that presence, gentle and patient, like the wind through the leaves." He held the small book in his hands, brushing the cover lightly, almost as if it belonged to that person he spoke of. "We shared so many quiet moments," he continued, his voice catching slightly. "And though they are not here now, the waiting is my way of honoring them." I watched him carefully. His eyes, though lined with sadness, shone with a certain light, a quiet hope that refused to fade. It was a hope that was not loud or demanding, but steady, like a candle burning softly in a dark room. In that moment, I understood a little more about the man on the bench. He was not merely waiting for someone to appear, he was carrying a love that had shaped his life, a devotion that could not be measured by time. The air between us was calm, almost sacred, and I realized that his story, though mostly hidden, was slowly opening to me. I did not yet know all the details, but I felt the truth beginning to shine through: this man's waiting was not empty. It was full of love, memory, and hope, waiting for the day he might see that important person again. As the days went on, the old man's hints about his past grew a little clearer, though still gentle and delicate, like soft petals floating on a quiet stream. One afternoon, the light was pale and silver, and the park seemed almost empty, except for us. He turned his eyes to the path, his gaze distant but steady. "There was someone," he began slowly, "someone very dear. I once walked through life with that person by my side. We shared mornings, we shared meals, we shared laughter that made the world feel smaller and kinder. His voice wavered, but it was never harsh, it carried warmth, and the weight of memory pressed softly against every word. I leaned closer, afraid to break the fragile moment. "Who?" I asked quietly. He shook his head, smiling faintly. "It is not time yet for names," he said. "But perhaps you can understand the feeling. When someone leaves a mark on your heart, even if they are no longer near, you carry them with you. Always." I looked at him closely and noticed the mixture in his eyes, sorrow for what was lost, but also hope, the kind of hope that refuses to disappear even when the world seems empty. "Did they leave?" I asked softly, careful not to press too hard. He nodded, but did not elaborate. Instead, he picked up his flower from the bench, held it gently, and said, "Even if they do not return, waiting is not in vain. Waiting keeps the heart alive." I felt a lump in my throat. I had never imagined that someone could wait with such patience, with such quiet strength. And yet, as I watched him, it felt almost natural. The old man, who had seemed a simple figure on a bench, was carrying a love so deep that it had shaped his days, his routines, and the way he moved through the world. His life, though touched by absence, was filled with devotion, and the park, the bench, and the flower were silent witnesses to his faith. In that moment, I understood something profound: even in loss, there can be beauty, and even in waiting, there can be meaning. Over the next few days, I visited the old man even more often. He began to share small memories, pieces of a life that once had laughter, warmth, and love. He spoke of walks along quiet streets, of a hand that once held his own, and of evenings by a small lamp, reading and talking about dreams. Though he never named the person, I could feel their importance in the way he paused at certain words, the way his eyes softened and sometimes glistened with unshed tears. "We had promises," he said one afternoon, little promises that seemed simple then, but they were everything. He held the flower in his hand, turning it slowly, and I could see that the waiting, the sitting, and the returning to this same bench was connected to those promises. I wondered how a person could carry such devotion day after day, season after season. It was not pain alone that made him sit here, but a mixture of love, memory, and hope, delicate yet strong. I felt that witnessing his patience was teaching me something profound about life. Finally, one gentle evening, when the park was bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, he spoke more openly. "Long ago," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I promised someone I would always wait for them here. No matter what happened, I would return to this bench, because it was a place that held our memories." He looked at the path ahead, his hands resting on his knees. "They never returned," he continued, "and yet, I wait. Because waiting is not just about them. Waiting keeps hope alive. Waiting keeps the heart alive." His words struck me deeply. I realized then that his entire life had been shaped by that promise. Every flower, every book, every day on this bench was a tribute. A quiet act of love and faith. The truth settled in my mind, heavy yet beautiful. This man, who had seemed so simple, carried a story of devotion that few could understand. His waiting was not foolishness, it was courage. It was a choice to love through absence, to hold on to hope despite uncertainty. I listened as he spoke of the days when he had thought the person might return any moment, the nights when he dreamed of their smile, and the mornings when he rose and came to the bench, no matter how tired or cold. Each memory seemed to strengthen his presence, making him part of the park itself, part of the town's quiet rhythm. Some days, he would pause and smile softly. "People call me foolish sometimes," he said. "They do not see that waiting is a kind of living." I understood immediately. His life was not empty. Every moment of his waiting carried meaning, teaching patience, love, and devotion. Even in their absence, the person he waited for had given him purpose, and that purpose shaped every breath he took. Children in the town began to notice him more closely, curious and unafraid. They greeted him with small waves and shy smiles. Some adults watched, unsure whether to pity him or admire him. I, too, began to feel admiration growing within me. The old man's patience and love were extraordinary. Sitting beside him, I realized that what he taught went beyond words. It was a lesson of faith in what we hold dear, even when the world seems to move on without us. Time passed, and the old man grew weaker. His steps became slower, his hands trembled slightly when he carried his book or flower. Yet, each day, he came to the bench. The town noticed, and people began to greet him with quiet respect. Some helped him to the bench when the weather was harsh. Others left flowers nearby in silent solidarity. He never asked for help, but he accepted it with grace, like a man who had long understood the rhythms of life. One chilly morning, as frost covered the grass, he turned to me and spoke in his soft, warm voice. "I have learned something important," he said. "Patience, love, and faith give life its meaning. Even if the person I wait for never returns, the waiting itself has been my journey." His eyes shone with a quiet certainty. "Do not forget," he added, "that life is made meaningful not by what comes to us, but by what we hold in our hearts." I sat beside him in silence, holding on to every word. I realized that his life had been a living lesson for all who noticed. Hope and devotion are stronger than loss, stronger than disappointment. His waiting had touched more people than he would ever know. Children waved, neighbors nodded, and I simply listened, grateful for the wisdom that came from such quiet, patient love. A few days later, I arrived to find the bench empty. A small white flower lay where he had sat, and a soft wind moved through the branches above. I understood that he had passed quietly, leaving behind his lesson, his devotion, and the memory of a life lived with unwavering hope. Though the park felt emptier, his presence remained in the hearts of everyone who had watched him, a gentle reminder that some teachings are found in patience, love, and quiet faith. The morning after the old man's passing, the bench felt strangely empty. I walked slowly through the park, noticing every detail that had once seemed ordinary but now felt different. The flowers nearby swayed gently in the breeze, the fountain's water sparkled in the early sunlight, and the trees cast long shadows across the grass. Everything was the same, yet without him, the park seemed quieter, softer, almost as if it were holding its breath. I sat on the bench where he had always rested, feeling the cool wood beneath me, and thought about the many days he had spent here. Rain or shine, strong wind or gentle warmth, he had returned without fail. His routine, once ordinary to those who saw it from afar, now appeared extraordinary. It was filled with devotion, patience, and hope. I remembered the small book he carried, the single white flower he placed on the bench, and the gentle smile he gave to anyone who passed. For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined him sitting beside me, looking down the path with the same quiet expectation. The park, the bench, and the path had become a symbol, a testament to a life that taught without words. People began to notice the empty bench. Children stopped to look at it, whispering to their parents about the man who had always been there. Neighbors paused on their walks, some leaving flowers or a note, as if honoring the invisible presence that had shaped their days. I realized that although he was no longer physically present, his spirit remained woven into the town's life. His waiting had not been in vain. It had touched the hearts of many, teaching them a quiet lesson about love, hope, and the meaning of patience. And as I sat there, the wind brushing past my face, I felt a warmth that seemed to come from him, a gentle reminder that even in absence, one can leave behind a life full of guidance and inspiration. The bench, now empty, had become more than a seat, it was a place where the memory of devotion lived on, a silent teacher reminding us all that some lessons are learned not from what we gain, but from the love we hold, and the hope we never give up. In the days that followed, the town seemed quieter, but in a thoughtful, reflective way. People who had once hurried past the park now slowed their steps. They looked at the bench, now empty, and remembered the old man who had sat there for so many years. Some spoke softly to one another, sharing memories of seeing him every day, carrying his small book or flower, always patient, always kind. Children, who had once waved to him shyly, now paused and placed tiny flowers on the bench, as if they understood that it was a special place. Parents explained in simple words what patience and devotion meant, using his life as an example. Even those who had once thought him foolish began to see something different, courage and love that lasted longer than a lifetime. People remembered his quiet smile, his soft voice, the gentle way he acknowledged everyone who passed. His presence had been a gentle rhythm in the town's daily life, and now, in his absence, that rhythm felt both missing and precious. I noticed neighbors stopping during their walks, gazing at the bench with a mixture of sorrow and respect. Some left notes, written simply, "Thank you for teaching us patience," or "Your love touched our hearts." It became clear that the old man had been more than just a man on a bench, he had been a living lesson for everyone. His life, though filled with waiting, had shaped the way people saw their own days. Waiting, love, and faith, three simple acts, could leave a mark deeper than any rush, any word, or any gift. And so, the bench became a symbol. Not of loss alone, but of hope, devotion, and the quiet power of living with purpose. I found myself returning often, thinking of him and feeling the lessons he left behind. I realized that though the bench was empty, his story was alive in the hearts of the town. And every time someone passed by, smiled, or left a flower, it was as if he were still there, teaching without speaking, showing without acting, reminding us all that patience and love can change the world quietly, yet completely. I often sat on the empty bench, remembering the old man and the quiet lessons he had taught. Sometimes, I closed my eyes and imagined him returning, smiling at the world with his soft patience. The park seemed different without him, yet the lessons he left were everywhere. The flowers on the ground, the sunlight through the trees, the children waving as they ran past, they all reminded me of him. I realized that his waiting had not been only for someone he loved. It had also been a way of teaching all of us about hope, faith, and the importance of patience. Even his silence, his simple presence, spoke louder than many words ever could. People who had once dismissed him now spoke of him with reverence. His life had become a story of inspiration, quietly shaping the hearts of everyone in the town. I remembered the words he had spoken during our last conversation: patience, love, and faith give life its meaning. Those words had stayed with me, echoing in my mind like a gentle song. I realized that his waiting was not about loss alone, it was about devotion, about carrying hope through each day, no matter how small the chance of return. Each flower he had placed, each book he had carried, each day he had returned to the bench, it was all part of a life dedicated to love and faith. And in his absence, that dedication seemed even more powerful. It reminded me that true lessons are often simple, but they take a lifetime to understand fully. The town slowly adjusted to life without him, but his presence remained in spirit. The children still waved at the empty bench, sometimes leaving small drawings or flowers. Adults paused to think of him when their days grew busy or stressful. Even visitors who did not know him could feel the quiet weight of his devotion when they walked through the park. It was as if the old man had woven a thread of hope through the town, one that could not be broken by absence. People began to talk about waiting not as something sad or lonely, but as an act of love and courage. I often returned to the bench to reflect on what I had learned. I thought of the old man's life, his quiet patience, and the love that had driven him to wait each day. I realized that his waiting had taught me more than I could have imagined. Life is full of uncertainty, loss, and absence, but it is also full of meaning when we carry hope, faith, and love in our hearts. The bench, though empty, became a place of meditation, a reminder that life's deepest lessons often come from simple, steadfast devotion. Walking past the park now, I noticed how differently people looked at the world. They slowed down, watched more carefully, and appreciated small moments. The story of the old man had spread quietly, influencing hearts without force. I thought about his strength, the courage it took to wait every day, and the way he carried both sorrow and hope together. His life reminded us that sometimes the most powerful teaching is not in words, but in living with patience, love, and unwavering faith. I began to share his story with others, telling children and adults alike about the man who waited each day on the bench. I spoke of his love, his devotion, and the gentle way he faced life. People listened, and slowly, I saw them thinking differently about their own lives. Waiting was no longer simply idle, it was a way to honor love and hope. Faith and patience became virtues they tried to practice, inspired by the quiet example of the old man. Over time, I understood that his life was more than a story of absence, it was a story of presence. Presence in patience, in hope, and in devotion. Even though he had waited for someone who never returned, his waiting created something greater, a legacy of love that reached beyond himself. His life taught us that meaning is not always found in what we gain, but in what we hold in our hearts and share through our example. And so, when I sit on the bench now, I remember him, not with sadness, but with gratitude. I remember the lessons he quietly taught us: patience, love, and faith can shape a life and touch the hearts of many. Sometimes, the person who waits teaches us more than the one who arrives.